You remember that time when Sports Illustrated was supposed to be a sports magazine? Yeah, that was funny. Sports Illustrated, I was a long-time subscriber to Sports Illustrated. I will acknowledge that as a religious person, I always took the option, you can do this, of calling up Sports Illustrated and not getting the swimsuit edition, which was, basically material for teenage boys. I would always call up Sports Illustrated and say, add an issue to the end of my subscription and just don't send the swimsuit edition. But the swimsuit edition has been a long time thing for Sports Illustrated, and always, basically, it was hot models and body paint on the beach. That's always what it was. Well, now, Sports Illustrated, because it has become another preserve of the woke, has decided that it is time to cram down on red-blooded American males a particular perception of female beauty, namely dudes. So there is a trans woman who has now been featured on the cover of Sports Illustrated. This is the trans woman whose name is Lena Bloom. Now, Lena Bloom has had surgeries and hormone treatment and looks physically like a woman, right? Which, by the way, seems rather transphobic to me, because if you truly, Sports Illustrated, wanted to make the case that trans women are women, then trans women shouldn't have to look like swimsuit models. In fact, trans women, this seems fatphobic to me. Trans women should actually look like Laurel Hubbard. Why isn't Laurel Hubbard on the cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition? The New Zealand weightlifter who's now going to be weightlifting in the Olympics and has more to do with sports than Lena Bloom. Why is it that only a trans woman who looks like a stereotypical swimsuit model in a low-cut bikini is now considered a fitting figure for the cover of Sports Illustrated? It seems very, very fatphobic, very transphobic, frankly, because it seems to suggest that the only trans women who ought to be treated as women are trans women who conform to all stereotypes regarding women. Lena Bloom, my understanding has had all of the surgeries to fake female body parts. But as we know, that is to suggest that is a requirement of trans women to be treated as women is violative of their norms. It is violative of decency. So truly, Sports Illustrated has not gone far enough until Sports Illustrated suggests that red-blooded American males get used to the idea of a trans woman who looks exactly like a man. Because as we know, sex is really all in your head. Gender is really all in your head. And the person on the cover of Sports Illustrated shouldn't have to be a swimsuit model-looking male masquerading as female. It should be a dude with twig and berries and chest hair and no fake breasts being treated essentially the same as a woman. That's when we know we've reached parity, I think. I think that's the really important thing. Now, look, the reason that Sports Illustrated is doing this is for the bleeps and giggles, right? They are doing it to push forward the quote-unquote social justice agenda. The idea being that if they push forward a biological man on the cover of Sports Illustrated as a woman, and if you say, no, even if that biological man has had many surgeries and hormone treatments to look like a woman, that is still a biological man, that if you say that, then this means that you are somehow transphobic, or even though that is the biological truth, or that you're mean and vicious. Look, Sports Illustrated's a free company, it can do what it wants, right? It's a private company. But there is obviously a social attempt to normalize the idea that biological men who look like women are in fact women, which of course is a wild degradation of what it actually means to be a woman, a word with an actual definition. So it's pretty obvious what Sports Illustrated is doing here. But Sports Illustrated didn't stop there. So one of the other models on the cover of SI Swimsuit Edition is, of course, the tremendous Megan Thee Stallion, because of her tremendous history with sports. According to Sports Illustrated Swimsuit Edition, Megan Thee Stallion is no stranger to magazine covers, but the rapper and songwriter always dreamed of being on the cover of SI Swimsuit, which is a weird dream. She remembers as a young girl looking at the magazine and saying, one day, this is going to be me. A couple of decades later, the Houston native would have several Grammys under her belt and make history as the first rapper on the SI Swimsuit cover. And she is the perfect fit. Amazing. Amazing. And then finally, they have an athlete on the cover. So who is the athlete who's on the cover of Sports Illustrated? The athlete on the cover of Sports Illustrated is Naomi Osaka. Now, you will recall that Naomi Osaka withdrew from one of the tennis majors after a blow-up with the media in which she just wouldn't do her media hits. And the ATP, the Tennis Professional Association, they said, you need to do that, right? It is your job. Part of your job as a tennis player is to deal with the media, because this is true in all sports. You're supposed to do the press conferences. And Naomi Osaka then went out and she claimed that she suffered from deep anxiety Not diagnosed anxiety, just deep anxiety at dealing with the media. Okay, fair enough. If you suffer from, like, I know people, I'm very close to people who have anxiety disorders that ought to be treated with kid gloves. You have to make provision for that, obviously. Naomi Osaka sort of suggested that that's what was going on. You know what people with anxiety disorders typically don't do? People who are shirking media attention, people who just want to stay away from the media and don't want to be involved with me. You know what they typically don't do? Pose for the cover of, I believe, Time magazine has now done a cover on Naomi Osaka, and also Sports Illustrated. So strange that she doesn't want to take questions from, people who ask critical questions, but if you are doing a Sports Illustrated cover or a Time magazine cover, then all of a sudden, all the hesitancy goes away. And by the way, it's not as though Naomi Osaka was being asked, like, vicious, brutal questions. She was being asked questions about, like, her performance as a tennis player. Says Sports Illustrated, Naomi Osaka is no doubt an athletic powerhouse. At 23, she holds 4 Grand Slam titles and is headed to Tokyo to compete in the Olympics. This comes after defeating former U.S. Open champion Samantha Stosur in her WTA Tour debut at just 16. It's her strength and power off the court that makes Naomi a true legend. She's raised awareness about racial injustice, human rights, and mental health, cementing her as one of the most outspoken professional tennis players. Outspoken except when she won't talk to anybody who, has a question. My favorite quote from her Time magazine cover piece is she suggested, I just don't understand why anyone would disagree with me. Like she said she was surprised that anyone would disagree with her about her very left-wing view of race in the United States. She was named one of 2020 Sports Illustrated Sportspersons of the Year for her activism, was on Time's annual list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Finally, there is the Sports Illustrated take on Lena Bloom. Okay, so here is what the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition says. Quote, Lena Bloom began her rise, remember Lena Bloom is a biological man, began her rise to fame in the ballroom dance community and has since broken numerous barriers in the modeling world. She was one of the few openly transgender models to walk the runway during New York Fashion Week in 2017 and was the first transgender woman of color to appear in Vogue India. And how about acting? Yes, she's tackling that too. Lena made her acting debut in the film Port Authority, marking the first film in Cannes Film Festival history that featured a transgender woman of color in a leading role. Now, Lena makes history yet again as the first transgender cover model in Sports Illustrated swimsuit history and the first trans person of color to appear on our pages. More importantly, the 27-year-old uses this platform to speak about acceptance, love, and change. She's passionate about inspiring others to love themselves and be who they want to be, unless they're a dude who just wants a biological woman, in which case they're a vicious, brutal sexist. That'd be terrible. So say the editors, among the many things we've learned over the past 18 months is how much we value being part of a community, how much we miss that interaction when it's taken away. This issue represents the culmination of our powerful community coming together during these trying times to make history. This is what the editor says. So wonderful stuff. I'm sure that all of the 17-year-old boys who are receiving the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition will be thrilled to see a man who believes he is a woman and has had surgeries to look like a woman on the cover of the magazine. Now, again, I don't care very much about the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. Just as a cultural marker, it seems significant, right? We're not going to play this gaslighting game where the left does something. They say it's highly significant. You point out that it is highly significant that we are treating a transgender woman the same way we would treat an actual born woman swimsuit model on the cover of magazines. And then they say, why are you even noticing? Is it important to you? The Sports Illustrated cover isn't important to me. What's important to me is the mandate that has come down from our cultural commissars that we act as though a male who has had hormone treatments and surgeries is the full equivalent to a woman in every way, including in terms of sexual attraction. That is a very interesting and I think rather unsupportable take in actual life, but it's something that the media wish to cram down, for sure, for sure.